Push it live. All right. Live on live on YouTube. All right, let's roll. All right, we are live once again. Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to another NGSBA webinar. My name is Michael Quedal, Associate Director of Marketing for the New Jersey School Boards Association, and thank you so much for joining us today as we talk about today's webinar, School Funding Update, Education Highlights from the proposed FY 2026 state budget. Join us this morning for an informative webinar designed to help school districts prepare for the 2025-2026 budget cycle. With a focus on changes in state aid, NGSBA's governmental relations team and its business administrator residents will provide a rundown of the education-related provisions of Governor Murphy's proposed spending plan for fiscal year 2026. Staff will also provide insights into the latest state aid calculations, key budget considerations, and strategies to ensure financial stability for your district. We're going to be talking about understanding the state budget and revisions to state aid calculations. We're going to be speaking about strategies for budget planning for 25-26, and of course, best practices to navigate financial challenges. So definitely stick around for the duration of the presentation. We have a ton to get through. This webinar does offer one board member academy credit for all those in the room this morning in the Zoom room. Thank you all so much for being here live. For those who stay for the duration of the presentation, will receive one board member academy credit. Just give us a couple business days for that to be reflected on your transcript due to it being a manual process on our end. A couple things regarding the Zoom features really quickly before we get going here. Towards the right side of your buttons, as always, you will see the CC button. That is your closed captioning functionality. If you click that, it'll allow you to view the closed captioning of this session. You will also be able to view and save the entire transcript of this session if you need it. The Q&A is turned on. The chat is also turned on, but we do ask you to use the Q&A function on the bottom of your screen, the button Q&A, to ask any and all questions. It just gives us a better way to organize what comes in. But the chat, like I said, is turned on. So if you want to drop us a comment, say hi, tell us where you're from. We'd love to hear from you. And thank you so much for being here this morning. Attendees of this webinar should be aware that the views expressed by non-NGSBA employees and outside speakers or panels are intended purely for informational purposes and do not necessarily represent the views, opinions, or mission of the New Jersey School Boards Association. NGSBA remains committed to providing nonpartisan and apolitical information, resources, and advocacy to advance public education and promote the achievement of all students through effective governance. As always, this session is being recorded and simulcasted on our YouTube channel. So all those watching live on YouTube, hello, thank you so much for joining us. But like I said, this session is being recorded and will be available on our SWGO website, how everyone came in through the meeting here this morning. The slide deck will also be uploaded onto SWGO, our webinar platform, as a resource as well. So definitely check out the slide deck after the presentation. And then as always, visit us on our website, ngsba.org, under the trainings tab, click webinars. That's where you'll see this recording. Later today, I'll upload it, along with a catalog of all of our past webinars, including some great webinars upcoming as well. So definitely check that out as well. So thank you all so much. It is now my great pleasure to introduce Jonathan Pushman, Senior Director of Advocacy from the New Jersey School Boards Association. Good morning, Jonathan.
Good morning, Michael. Thank you for that thorough introduction. Just a quick mic check. Everything coming in sound-wise okay?
You sound great. Go ahead.
Excellent. All right. Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Jonathan Pushman, Senior Director of Advocacy with the New Jersey School Boards Association. Looking forward to providing this update today. We do pride ourselves in being a consistent, reliable source of timely information, and we are quickly heading into a deep dive into budget season at the state level, just as you guys are at the local level. So before we dive into the presentation, we have a lot of information to go through. We're going to move fairly quickly just because we have so much to report on. Before I dive in, I just want to introduce our team real quick. Veteran member of the School Boards Association and a legal whiz, our senior legislative counsel, John Burns, is here with us this morning. Our newest member of the governmental relations team, helping with our advocacy efforts, Harrison Silver, who joined us last year. And Charlie Muller, our expert on school finance and state aid issues, joined us as our business administrator in residence about a year and a half ago. And he'll be here to provide sort of a deeper level of information on how state aid gets calculated and some of the things you guys might need to start thinking about as you finalize your budgets. So with that, I'll just kick things off. I'm going to begin with kind of a review of the proposed FY2026 state budget, so to give a high level perspective of the overall budget, and then give you some information on how it will impact schools. As Michael mentioned, we really appreciate if you use the Q&A function to pose any questions. And if it's related to content we're touching on at a particular time in the presentation, we'll try and address it right away. John Burns will be monitoring that. And if it's not something related, we may not get to it. And if we don't get to it right away, we'll try and address it by the end of the presentation. And the chat can be used to comment or exchange information with other attendees, or just to say hello to one another. After I give those education highlights, I'm going to hand it over to, and what the next steps in the budget process are, I'll hand it off to Charlie, and he'll kind of give a deep dive into how state aid was changed this year, updates to the educational adequacy report, the time frame for what for the development of your budgets, and as well as some things you might be thinking about to try and make your budgets a little bit more efficient and effective. So with that, I'll jump into the proposed 26 state budget that Governor Murphy delivered on Tuesday, February 25th. This is the largest budget in state history. Just to give you a big picture, it's over a $58 billion budget. It's been steadily increasing in recent years, as has the amount that has been directed to you all in the form of school aid. Nearly 40% of the overall state budget goes towards education in some fashion. And we'll give a breakdown of the different pots of money, where that money goes to, over the next couple of slides. But this does constitute the largest investment in education ever in state history. And as you can see from that nice little chart that we've thrown into this slide, after we had several years of relatively flat funding in the mid-20 teens, we've now seen a significant ramp up year after year of pumping more and more money into the school funding formula, particularly going into direct formula aid. Out of that $22 billion, that is the overall pot of school aid, and I'll explain what that means. Out of that money, out of that amount, there's direct formula aid, and that's the big buckets like the equalization aid, transportation aid, special education, and security aid make up the bulk of that $12.06 billion. From the current fiscal year to this fiscal year, we've seen an increase of $386 million over FY 2025. So thankfully, where we were really expecting a difficult budget year heading into FY 2026 at the state level, and even potentially beyond that, as we've heard the state wants to do a little bit more belt tightening in the years ahead, with potential fears of a recession or the revenues not coming in as robustly as they have in recent budget cycles. Thankfully, we have seen a continued increase in funding for schools. So while we've seen a lot of other departments and other areas in the budget that were either reduced or eliminated, thankfully we're seeing a continued commitment to invest in our public education system, and that's reflected as a priority in the FY 2026 state budget. So next slide. So this is a nice little chart. This is something that's included in the documents known as the budget in brief that the governor releases in conjunction when he delivers his budget address in that fourth Tuesday in February every year. And it provides a nice breakdown and big picture of all the big pots of money for school aid, how it is going to be adjusted from one year to the next. So you can kind of see how each of those buckets of aid are being adjusted from the current fiscal year into the next fiscal year. The top portion of that chart represents that formula aid. I mentioned again those a lot of those buckets of security, transportation, equalization, and special education aid, and a couple of others. Preschool education aid is also included in direct formula aid, and we've seen a continued commitment to increasing pre-K aid in recent budget cycles, and that's been continued this year. And then you have things like extraordinary special education aid. We'll discuss that a little bit more in the later in the presentation. One of the things that a lot of our members may not necessarily know, particularly our newer members, is when we talk about overall school aid, it's not just that direct aid that goes to schools that can support school level programs and services or facility projects and things along those lines. But the state also picks up a handful of other costs and absorbs them on behalf of school districts. And some of the biggest ones, and that's sort of that second section of the chart here, those direct state payments for education. Thankfully, rather than putting that on the backs of local school districts and taxpayers, the state actually picks up the cost of things like the employer share of the pension cost, post-retirement medical benefits for teachers, and Social Security costs. So when we talk about direct aid, that's that $14.1 billion number in total aid to schools. There's another big pot of money that brings us up to that $22.185 billion that is directed as overall total school aid. So again, that commitment by the state leads us to nearly 40% of the overall state budget. So again, we're seeing a nearly 3% increase in that direct aid to schools. But when combined with everything else, we're seeing over $444 million increase in overall school aid in FY26 as compared to FY 2025. And if you go into things, and we're going to have some links later in the presentation for those who are interested in going into that budget in brief. The more detailed budget was issued by the governor's office earlier this week that provides a high level of detail in terms of where this money is going to be directed, all the line items and language provisions of how that money is proposed to be allocated. Let's go to the next slide, Harrison. So again, out of that proposed in that proposed 26 state budget, $12 billion in direct formula aid, significant increase over the previous year. But one of the things I wanted to talk about is, and some of you may already be aware of this, is that this budget, there's some new wrinkles regarding how state aid is being calculated and allocated to our member districts. Many of these adjustments that they're making to the formula of how they're allocating aid are intended to increase predictability and reduce volatility regarding year-over-year increases or decreases in state aid. Some of you know have been around for a few years, know that in recent budget cycles, we've seen some pretty steep increases and decreases from one year to the next at the district level. Some that are getting increases from one year, seeing increases for several years, suddenly started seeing decreases, and vice versa. So one of the things, and this was, some of you know that the Department of Education conducted a series of public hearings at the end of December and in January, where they solicited feedback from the public. They held public hearings and solicited comment on adjustments that stakeholders would like to see through the funding formula. And the adjustments that they're making to state aid this year reflect a lot of the recommendations that people brought to the DOE. And so I'll get into a few of them now. One of them was that they actually, for the first time ever, notified districts over a week before they got their state aid figures that they would not be getting, that no district would be experiencing a more than 3% cut on their state aid in the four main aid categories that I referenced earlier, that equalization, special education, security, and transportation. So a way to kind of give districts a heads up that you weren't going to be, potentially seeing double-digit decreases in state aid from one year to the next. And we know that several districts did experience that in recent years. So they did that through a broadcast memo before the budget came out. We've never seen that happen before. So that I think that was something that was welcome. Nobody likes to see a cut, but at least you kind of knew from a planning standpoint, this was the absolute maximum I might lose in the next budget cycle. What they didn't notify budgets the districts of, but what we learned once the budget came out is that they also put a 6% cap on year-over-year aid increases in those four main categories, I guess, in order to mitigate how much a district could lose from one year to the next. They needed to cap how much other districts would be seeing an increase are. So a way of kind of squeezing things, creating sort of smoothing out state aid from one year to the next is a term we've been hearing used quite frequently recently. They also,
John,
yes,
John, there's a question in the chat about that.
sure.
And the question is, how does the state explain their position that state aid is fully funded while limiting increases to 6%? Meanwhile, the state aid notices are showing the full amount of uncapped aid.
Yeah, I think that's a fair question. And Steve, thanks for joining us. I know we've had some correspondence on this in the past. We're actually trying to get that same level of detail ourselves. We'll be monitoring the hearings from the DOE in discussions with Commissioner Damer and with other stakeholders. So I think we want to be careful about the language that we use regarding what full funding actually means, because there does seem to be a potential disconnect between saying that the funding formula is fully funded, while we're knowing that some districts aren't getting what they otherwise would have if they had run the formula as is without these adjustments. So waiting further details and clarification from the department and seeking that out from them as well as with our other stakeholders. So I think it's a fair point, Steve, and that's why we want to be careful about how we couch this dialogue in terms of whether the formula is fully funded pursuant to SFRA as is, or if that really means full funding including these adjustments. And so we're seeking out that clarification ourselves. So the local fair share is another thing that they looked at. That's essentially what the state says you should be able to raise at the local level. This is instead of using a one-year snapshot, they're now through this budget going to use a multi-year average for income and property wealth calculations. So that, again, to try and mitigate the volatility from one year to the next in terms of what your local fair share is, because that drives how much aid you're going to get from the state in terms of your equalization aid to try and get you to your adequacy budgets. In special education, right now they use a statewide average classification rate that assumes all districts have the same percentage of special education students, which we know is not the case in reality. So for the first time since SFRA was enacted, they're going to an actual enrollment calculation, and they also, in conjunction with that, increasing overall special education aid by over $400 million over FY 2025. They also, through the educational adequacy report that Charlie will discuss a little bit later in the presentation, making adjustments for what's considered your adequacy budget by including adjustments for mental health and school security costs. I do want to also clarify that these changes are only valid for 1 year if the legislature accepts them. If we were going to make those permanent, we would need a statutory change to the school funding formula because anything in the budget is only applicable for that particular fiscal year. So TBD on whether or not they will actually make these changes permanent in future budget cycles. But this is what we have before us heading into the budget that begins on July 1. As I mentioned, preschool expansion aid is also a line item that's being increased this year, nearly a 3% increase. And some of that money is going to be set aside to expand pre-K into districts that don't currently offer it, sort of aligned with Governor Murphy's priority of trying to establish universal pre-K throughout the entire state. Extraordinary special education aid. This is additional aid that's provided to districts with classified students who incur expenses above certain thresholds that are set in statute. It's a reimbursement of the percentage of costs above those thresholds. This is being flat funded at $420 million for the third consecutive year, which is the largest amount that they've ever put into extraordinary special education aid. Unfortunately, some would consider this a cut because we know your special education costs continue to rise every year, so that essentially reduces the amount that you would be reimbursed for those special education costs, but thankfully, at least it's better than a cut, I guess is one way to frame it. Teacher recruitment, there's been a consistent effort by the state to try and help mitigate teacher shortages across the state, and they put money into recent budgets for teacher scholarships, stipends, and loan redemptions. That's being decreased from a total of $11.5 million to $3.5. We'll see if the legislature intervenes to try and add more into those line items. And for the second consecutive year, we're at $50 million being set aside to the SDA that'll be available to all districts for capital projects and emergent needs. Next slide. Some new things that we've seen in the budget. You've heard the governor make a lot of statements that he wants to see cell phone free schools. So he's proposing $3 million for a phone free schools grant that would incentivize districts to implement policies that exceed any minimum guidelines set by the DOE. And there is currently legislation moving through the legislature that would require all districts to have policies on cell phone free environments. You probably read about those in school board notes, and they're making their way to the governor's desk. So help support districts put these policies in place. He's proposing $3 million. Also proposing $2 million for school lead filters and provide grants to districts to help for Clean Water Initiative. It's also continuing to fund what's been known as the Working Class Families Anti-Hunger Act that increased the eligibility for who qualifies for free school meals by increasing the income threshold. So that'll continue to fund school meals for an additional 17,000 students that newly qualify for that. Continuing to fund summer meals programs by participating in the summer EBT program that'll help the state leverage even more federal dollars for that initiative. And then flat funding for the Department of Children and Families, New Jersey statewide support services, or the NJ4S network that was stood up a few years ago to provide behavioral and mental supports for students through that regional hub and spoke model. From an academic standpoint, we see continuing to fund high impact tutoring. There were some federal grants that were used in the past, and we'll be putting some state dollars into that to support grants for high impact tutoring. And now he's putting also money in to help fund 2 new state laws that were signed last summer to enhance student literacy. There are 2 laws, one that's established the Office of Learning Equity and Academic Recovery, and in another that will fund screenings for students. There will be new requirement that students in K through 3rd grade receive periodic screenings on literacy to make sure that they're keeping up. So that will help districts fund those types of screenings, and then continued funding for computer science and artificial intelligence programs that will provide professional development and course offerings for those subjects. Slide.
John, there's a quick question
Sure.
about the previous slide.
Yes,
it's related to it with regard to
see.
the federal meals program.
Thanks, Johnny. Yeah, I see there was a question about whether we're aware of any changes anticipated in the federal meals program for free and reduced student meals. It's something we're keeping an eye on very closely. The new Secretary of Education was just confirmed. I believe it was last week or the week before. We did see an announcement from the Department of Agriculture that they were going to be cutting funding for a program that incentivizes districts to purchase meals from local farmers or producers. But we are waiting to see how the changes at the federal level are going to impact those programs. So it's a timely question, but it's something we don't have clarity on at this point in time. Go ahead. Next slide. So as you know, the state has also been putting money to help incentivize shared services and regionalization efforts. So they're continuing to fund those 2 programs through the DCA that would help fund feasibility studies for districts that are interested in exploring regionalizing with a neighboring district. Some other new language and line items we've seen in the budget, tax levy incentive aid that was proposed in conjunction when the governor made his changes to state aid allocations. Appears that the administration will be providing some additional funds to districts that are currently below adequacy and local fair share. They go out to the voters, raise above their to raise their tax levy above what's currently allowable under the 2% cap, or through an application process that we're just starting to get some more detailed information on, but seems to be an attempt to have some shared sacrifice between the state, that the state would put some additional money to districts that are willing to go out and go above their local tax levy. The governor continues to push for allowing 16 and 17-year-olds to vote in school board elections, which Newark will be doing next month. So he's put $1 million in for grants to local units for startup costs and poll worker training should they choose to um, uh, follow Newark's lead on that initiative. And something else you might have read about in school board notes, there seems that we've been pushing for reform to public notice requirements now that so many newspapers are no longer offering print editions, how we're going to handle that moving forward. And the state has proposed a potential $20 million in savings through public notice reform. We don't know quite what that will look like yet, but maybe it'll allow the state and local entities to post public notice on their own website. So just a couple of new initiatives I wanted to highlight in this presentation that we're just starting to get some more details on. And so moving forward, the Treasury released its full detailed budget. We'll post a link to that. I think we have one in this presentation. If not, we'll add one in here before we send it out to you. Provides a lot more higher level detail on what's in there for education and for the entire state. Public hearings have now been scheduled, so anybody who's interested in signing up wants to testify before the Assembly or Senate Budget Committees. Registration is live. They'll begin in earnest next week. And then we'll have the legislature will go on budget break and begin a series of hearings with the heads of various state departments. And the legislature has a deadline to pass the budget by the end of June to meet that constitutional deadline. Fingers crossed they'll meet that deadline so that we can all enjoy our 4th of July weekend. So with that kind of gives you all the education highlights. I do want to now hand things off to our business administrator in residence, Charlie Muller, explain how state aid was adjusted this year and to give you guys some things to think about as you finalize your budget. So I'll stop talking now and let Charlie run things from here. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Jonathan. Good morning, everyone. I hope you're all having a wonderful day and enjoying the webinar so far. The section that we'll talk about is going to really look at some of the background and some of the numbers and how the per pupil costs are determined on your state aid printouts. Consider it almost like a tag team, where in the fall, you're going to do your ISSA report, you do your TRS report, you do your special ed report, and it all gets filed in Trenton. Trenton then takes those numbers and will put them into the state aid calculations, and then you'll get your state aid notices toward the end of February. So we generate all those from our internal reports. The Educational Adequacy Report has been around since 2009. And basically, the School Funding Reform Act of 2008 requires that the governor issue an educational adequacy report every 3 years. This document is 2026, marks the 5th cycle of the governor's recommendations according to statutory requirements. If you look at the chart that's on the next page, you'll see that in the original 2009, the base amount per student was $9,649. If you notice the next 2 years, 2014 and 2017, budgets were frozen by the governor. It normally would follow the CPI rates. For 2026, they've actually made some changes. They're accounting for the increased cost per student as opposed to the CPI, because certain areas, the cost per student went up. But as you can see, the Educational Adequacy Report, as printed, tried to keep up with the increased costs on the base per student. Yeah, John. Harrison. The weights for students. In 2009, basically the elementary base and the weight applied to middle school has remained the same. The original School Funding Reform Act weight for a high school student was 1.17. So these weights basically just take a student's growth through the educational system, and as they go through middle school and high school, courses become more detailed. When you get to high school, you'll have your chemistry, you'll have your sciences, you'll have more sports, you'll have more mathematics, you have more academic programs, AP classes, and so on. So the cost as a child goes through the high school, goes through the educational process, the costs really increase. And again, these are consistent. And this will show up on your on the state aid printout called enrollment. So they factor your resident enrollment, and then they'll take the weights for each elementary, middle, and high school and add them to get your number of pupils they basically base some of your state aid on. Okay, security aid. Again, you notice that from 23 to 26, security for all students went up and additional security for at-risk students went down. Two main reasons for this. Security guard at the elementary level, they included that this year. And also they added benefits to the cost per student, which gives you a much better detail of what the cost for security is, especially by adding benefits when they've increased as much as they've had in the past few years. Again, you can see that they're trying to keep up with the cost of educating our kids. Transportation aid, two areas again, general ed transportation and special education. The number of students is put on from your DRTRS, your district reported transported students. As you put these numbers in and you look at your state aid printout for transportation aid, you'll see that there's a number of students and there's also per mileage. So when they combine the students and they combine the mileage, you'll end up with your transportation aid.
Charlie, there's a question in the chat, and the question is, the multipliers for calculating local fair share change year to year. How does the state arrive at these multipliers?
That's an excellent question, and that's one of the answers we're trying to get. You're talking about for equalized valuation and income. Yeah, those numbers are consistent throughout the state, but we're trying to determine how they are actually determined. So that's a very good question, and we've been asking that. Our budget calendar. I'm sorry, we're special ed amounts. Special ed amounts, like Jonathan mentioned earlier, they were using 15.9% of your resident enrollments, which was census based. There are districts that were up to 17, 18% of special ed, and there are districts that were probably 5 to 10% of special ed. So someone wasn't getting the full reimbursements for special ed, and some were getting more than they actually had. So this year, they took the actual enrollment. Again, that's coming from your November counts of your special ed. So they'll take those counts, and that's what they're using to drive your special ed. Excuse me. Okay. Your budget calendar. This is the budget calendar that we're looking at right now. Is from the Department of Education's budget document. A couple months ago, we had a panel discussion with BAs from Ocean County and Hunterdon County. And the budget process, first of all, really never stops, but in earnest, it begins in the early to mid-fall. And at that point in time, districts and administrations and boards talk about what programs they want to offer, what is their class size they'd like to have, any new programs, any programs that need to be enhanced. So at that point in time, it's all a planning function, and no dollars really are added to anything. It's what we need to do to provide the education we want for our students. And that goes through the whole process. So these are these are various types of school districts. A majority of the districts are type 2 with the November election, which would be the second bullet. There's, I think, maybe 12 or 13 left that have an April election. Type 1 districts are appointed by the municipality. There's one state intervention district left, I believe. And there's 21 county vocational, and there's special services and education service commission. And there's 4 dates for a special election. The 5th date would actually be your November election when you elect board members. So we're going to use type 2 with the November election. Again, we're looking into March right now. It's just current. You got your state aid in the end of February. You should have had all your planning done. And now you can actually, that you have your state aid figures, people know they're not losing more than 3%. They're not gaining more than 6%. It narrows down your budget process. So on March 19th, districts will submit their tentative budget to the executive county superintendent for review. April 20th, the notice of public hearing 4 days prior to the earliest public hearing. Just a short note on this one. Once you submit your budget on March 19th for review by the county superintendent, that is not your final budget. You can be making changes with the county superintendent, but no changes can be made until your public hearing. At your public hearing, if you want to move and change your budget, yes, you can do that, but that's the last time you can do your public hearing. April 21st to finalize your budget, earliest date for your public hearing. For the sake of time and possible questions, I'm not going to read the rest to you. It's all there. You can read it. And your annual school elections next November. So right now, after the 19th, the budget will be reviewed by the county superintendent. Go ahead, John. Budget planning and best practices. Other than shared service, which a lot of districts have, I'm going to hit two areas that could possibly save you money. If it doesn't save you money, it could also make your district a little more effective. Transportation cost. This has become a big issue in the past. The cost of transportation is rising. Special ed costs are increasing. So you reduce the number of existing routes. This is not always popular. You can have, let's say you have 20 routes. What happens if you reduce those routes to 12 and combine the stops? Other than you're going to get a lot of phone calls from probably the community, because last year my stop was in front of my house and this year my stop's down the road a bit. But if you can combine those stops, it's very possible you can tier that bus on a second trip. You might be able to do a special ed run, or just add another route to that, or add another bus to that route. Change school starting times. This happens frequently. If you have multiple schools, you could start one at 7:30, start the other one at 8:45, or and it's usually the high school that starts early because of their sports programs in the afternoon. So you can change the starting times. This one, I don't know how often this happens, but you can find your public and non-public routes. You could even put in a childcare run in there and make that an actual stop. So you just run the bus. You run the bus along your normal route. You pick up the kids if they're going to go to maybe a vocational school, a non-public school. If it's on the route and the bus is going by the stop and the kids are there, why not pick them up and drop them off at the route? As long as it doesn't create additional time on the route. A lot of cases, it probably wouldn't. Create a shared service with other districts in your geographic area. Let's say you have a MD student and you have two. Well, you're going to most likely send them out because it might be cost prohibitive. Why don't we start a MD program at the school, contact our neighboring schools and say, you don't have to send them to a private school for the disabled. Send them to our school. We have them. We keep them locally. They're with their friends. They're with their other kids that they in the community that they live with. So there's options to do that, and you most likely will save a good amount of money on your transportation costs. All right, John Harrison. Sorry, Jonathan, I keep doing that to you. Staffing. This is issued. If you look at the original School Funding Reform Act, there's a sample in there for class size, or samples in there for benefits. And I would encourage all of you to go back and look at the Success for All and read the base of how all this information started. So this is a really difficult decision to make, and it's an emotional decision at times, especially if you have to let teachers go or move them that have been around for a long time. Let's evaluate our class size. Let's say we have a class size of 20 and we have two sections, but the other class size is 30. So if we average those out, can we live with a class size of 20, 25? Can we live with that? And that's some of the discussions that begin in the very beginning, back in the fall, of class sizes. What can we do? If you can't do that, or you can do that, maybe there's a class in 5th grade that has 30 kids. So maybe we need to move a teacher from the 1st grade or 2nd grade up into that area. Again, you may not save money, but you're not going to have a class size of 30 or 35. And that's how you're going to reallocate your staff. And you look at your attrition. This is not mentioned here, but what about attrition? Do we need to replace that particular staff member? If we do, you do. If you don't, you got to look at your class size. And again, you got to look at what the goals and the directives are for the district. If you want to maintain that low class size, that's what you want to do, then that's certainly your decision. Analyze all of your instructional, co-curricular, and extracurricular activities. And is there sufficient participation to continue the program? If you have a freshman baseball team with 8 kids, well, you're not going to be able to field a team. If you have 11 kids, you have 2 extras. What happens if someone gets hurt? So you need to make that determination. But you also have to keep in mind that you just can't get rid of all one program, especially the women's program. Under Title IX, they have to be equitable. And finally, create a shared service with another district for special ed programs. This goes back to the same area that I just mentioned before. Can we share programs? Can we develop a program locally and keep our students close to home? And with that, I think I left enough time for any comments or any questions. Thank you for listening.
Thank you,
So-
Charlie. Go ahead, John.
So there were a couple of questions that were in the chat from earlier. One of them has to do with can you explain how the state deems the allocations of state aid that each district got fair and equitable for districts with a lower tax base, i.e. poorer communities?
Well, this year, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to question fully, but this year they actually took 3 years averages, as opposed to prior years where they would only take 1 year. When using the 3-year average, it takes out any anomalies that may have happened in the prior year. I think the biggest example is one district had a community member that hit the lottery. Well, that throws the income completely out of whack. So if you take 3 years, it averages that out and doesn't give you a false indication that the district's extremely wealthy. So each one has their own taxes, which is, I believe, issued from the Department of Community Affairs, and their income is issued from the Division of Taxation. The multipliers that they're using, I call them multipliers, the factors that they use in the end are consistent throughout the state. And supposedly that they use that consistently to balance out everyone, so no one has a different factor. So it's based on it's based on your wealth, your value, property value, and your income. I don't know if that answered it fully, but it's always that factor that's at the end that's in question. Like I mentioned earlier, we're trying to get some clarification on how that number is calculated.
Thank you. And there's also a question related to the cell phone, the $3 million for cell phones that you mentioned earlier, John. And the question is, why does the state believe we need $3 million to implement cell phone policies?
I'll take a shot. I mean, this isn't our proposal. This is something that came out from the governor that he has considered a priority. And we really can only go by what we've learned through the budget documents that have been issued so far. And our understanding is this is a way to incentivize districts and provide them with grants to establish cell phone policies that it would exceed any minimum guidelines developed by the Department of Education. And we expect guidelines to be developed pursuant to legislation that's making its way through the legislature that we published an article on in school board notes earlier this year. So I guess it could be used for things like, those types of pouches that students put their phones in and lock them away. If they want to have, more stricter cell phone usage policies. Again, this is just proposed, and the language could change, the amount could change, or it could actually be zeroed out entirely by the legislature if they so choose. This is just a reflection of the governor's priorities. We know a lot of districts already have cell phone policies in place and don't necessarily need any kind of financial incentive, but maybe those that want to go over and beyond and could use some additional resources, a small pot of money will be made available for them.
And
That
there's
helps.
another question in the Q&A. For those districts who received supplemental aid last year, why wasn't it included in this year's calculations?
I would say because it's a one-year law. It was not something that was based in the formula. It was a supplemental stabilization aid that was provided by the legislature, approved by the governor after the state aid numbers came out. So the changes that you see in the state aid notices from fiscal year 25 to FY26 really represent the differences between the preliminary state aid figures that were issued to districts last February or early March. So because that was just a 1 year aid restoration statute, they were not reflected or captured in this year's state aid notices, is my understanding.
And there's another question in the chat that I'm not sure was addressed yet, which is the board member asks, can you explain equalized fair share and how it is going to be encouraged or implemented?
The best answer for that, John, is something that I can't answer verbally. If the board member would ask for a state aid printout called EQA, it's the equalization aid, which will show your local share. That's how all those calculations are done. So if the board member would get that sheet, ask their business administrator to explain that to them, it'll show the local fair share and how it's calculated and where it's applied.
Thank you. I don't see any other questions right now, John.
Okay, sounds good. So again, just on this slide, you'll see great way to keep up with all the latest information in and around the State House. Read your weekly school board notes. It lands in your inbox every Wednesday morning. Rarely does a week go by that we don't have some kind of update on legislative activity or on the state budget. We'll be reporting on those pushing out the detailed budget in an article next week. You can dive into you can find out all the state aid details. I mean, you all know about what your particular districts are slated to receive next year, but you want to see how that compares to the rest of the state. You can look at district by district figures and county level figures. All of the state budget publications are published on the Office of Management and Budget, OMB's website. So they'll continue to populate that. Right now, we have the budget in brief and the detailed budget on there. And the legislature will begin populating a lot of information regarding the budget on the Office of Legislative Services website. And that's where you can actually go register for a budget hearing. And then we'll start to see those departmental hearings get scheduled in the coming weeks. And there'll be a whole lot of analysis from the Office of Legislative Services on each department's budget that'll be published on there over the next couple of months. As always, we are available to assist or try and answer any questions that you all might have. There's all of our titles and email addresses there. I want to thank everybody who joined us this morning. We'll push this presentation out as part of our follow-up in the coming days. So thank you, John, Harrison, Charlie, to everybody who tuned in today. Hope this was worthwhile and that we gave you some information that will be useful to you all moving forward. Thank you again, and I'll send it back to you, Michael.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Yes, thank you so much, Harrison, Charlie, John. We do have an incredible staff here at NGSBA, so I definitely want to give a shout out to everyone who, not only works hard on these presentations, but works their tail off day in and day out to provide our membership with the most updated information as possible. That being said, I definitely want to give a quick shout out to the GR team as well for creating a new newsletter that we really view as a great resource is called NGSBA Capital Watch, and it's a quarterly newsletter that the Governmental Relations Department catalogs and updates for Board of Education members, school administrators, and other school leaders on legislation that could impact your school. It could impact your school district, but we know that there are definitely bills in here that are impacting school districts around the state. Everything from board governance, curriculum, instruction, funding, school security, staffing, student health and safety, transportation. There are thousands of bills that they go through each year, and they've picked out. They track hundreds of bills. I mean, Jonathan, you say all the time you track hundreds of bills per month. So I'm going to post that in the chat now. You should be receiving. You should have received that in the winter. If you didn't, just don't hesitate to reach out to anyone at NGSBA, and we'll see what happens. Sometimes, email addresses get unsubscribed by unknowingly. So definitely reach out if you didn't receive that. But it is published on our website as well. So definitely view that. If you have any questions, like Jonathan said, don't hesitate to reach out to anyone on the screen here or really anyone at NGSBA, and we'll forward it along to the folks that can get your question answered. Thank you all so much for joining us here this morning live. If you're in the room, all of those who are with us this morning and stayed or currently with us and stayed for the duration of the presentation will receive one board member academy credit reflected on their transcript in a couple business days. Like I said, it is a manual process on our end. If you're watching this on recording, thank you as well. We're so proud of this type of content. So that's it for us today. We hope everyone has a great rest of their Thursday. We hope everyone has a great rest of their week. And we will be back next week with more content on our webinar series. To view all upcoming webinars, again, ngsba.org under the trainings tab, click webinars, and that's where you'll see our upcoming content. So thank you all so much. Thank you to the presenters today, Jonathan, Harrison, Charlie, John, once again, and I hope everyone has a great weekend.